Our today's topic is global Ukrainian community. It will be illuminated by our guest lecturer, Stefan Romaniw, the first vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress and the co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm glad to be with you.
Due to your service for the Ukrainian community in Australia, as well as for the global Ukrainian community, you're well informed about everyday life and civic activism of Ukrainians worldwide. Even before the recent Russia's invasion, Ukrainians moved to other countries, albeit in different capacities. Can you please outline key historical waves of Ukrainian migration to Australia and globally, and how each new cohort of migrants integrated into host society and the already established local Ukrainian community?
Well, look, it's a pleasure to be with you and your students. The Ukrainian community internationally is one that I think is a model community for many other communities. In our countries, and we're the Ukrainian World Congress, for example, we have representation in 80 countries. We say that there are about 20, 25 million Ukrainians outside of Ukraine. And obviously, since the Russian invasion, I think the Ukrainian government has also recognized the importance of the organized Ukrainian diaspora. But to your question, in terms of the different migration flows, we have Ukrainian communities in Argentina, in South America, in Canada, in America, places that have been there for 120 years. You have migration, for example, of our Ukrainian community in Bosnia. A lot of the people in former Yugoslavia, they came, they settled because in the 20s, those countries were looking for migrants. The community here in Australia, for example, we're celebrating our 75th anniversary. Our parents, like the many that came, whether it be to the United Kingdom or whether it come to America or Canada, after the Second World War, were displaced people like we've got now. Our parents were forced out of Ukraine by then the Soviets. For example, my father came from Ternopil. He was forced to Germany, where he met my mother, who was German, and then migrated to Australia. If we look at their impact, the impact of the Ukrainian diaspora has been huge, and we could put in different phases. If we look at those that were before 1991, we were what we would call, in inverted commas, the ambassadors of what we understood as being the free Ukraine. We made sure that the international community that knew that the Soviet Union was a prison of nations, that those republics like Ukraine were being forced to do things that they didn't want to do. Ukrainians wanted their own identity. We know we had those who were put into gulags, those who were put into different prisons because they didn't believe in that Soviet system. So what we have today in 2024 and what happened in 2022, in 2022, is obviously just another indication that the Ukrainian spirit is very, very strong. I just wanted, before we go on to maybe another question, is highlight the issue of the Holodomor genocide. The Holodomor genocide in 1933, 33, the Ukrainian Women's Association in America were one of the first that was sending support to Ukraine in packages. So the Ukrainian community has always been very organized, very focused, and always standing to maintain its identity, and also to show that Ukraine is a country that has its own culture, its own language, and is the center of Europe. And this war that we have at the moment, small hiccup in terms of stopping Ukraine developing at this point in time, but we will win. And I think at the end of this war, many people will want to be Ukrainians, because the Ukrainian spirit will have killed Russian oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to clarify, so basically there were the waves of the post-World War, then around 1991, around Ukraine's independence, and then the current Russian aggression. So like three big waves and maybe smaller in between.
Yeah, look, there were post 91, obviously people started to travel more. And then we had, if you take the Australian experience, we had the Olympics here in 2000. Post 2000, people started to come to, Ukrainians started to migrate. And then we had a general flow, but then we had the Orange Revolution, and then we had the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan Nezalezhno, Maidan, Revoluция Hidnosti. To that point in time, the Ukrainian community, again, it was there at the pinnacle. It was there defending Ukraine. It was there calling on our governments to support Ukraine. And now, when the war started, obviously the Ukrainian diaspora, whether it's the Ukrainian World Congress or its members and the diaspora in general, I think have been an amazing support for Ukraine, which is being recognized by President Zelensky. We met with him about a month ago, who recognized the efforts of the diaspora, and diaspora now continues to play a major role. Keep in mind that, we can talk a bit about the war later, but cultural diplomacy, always, our cultural groups, our youth groups, the Ukrainian Youth Association, SUM, plus women's associations, credit societies, historical societies. I've just come back from a university this afternoon, Monash University, and there is an exhibition which is Hope for Hope. In other words, what it shows is Ukrainian culture. So it was Ukrainian culture, cultural diplomacy at its best. So I think people need to understand that the role of the diaspora is huge. We're a very organized diaspora. And when I say we're a model diaspora, our parents knew how to integrate. Our parents knew how to integrate into different societies. And, we had a bit of a conversation yesterday. I mentioned to you this Chinese proverb. From our point of view, my generation, the generations before me, the generations that, now the younger generation, there's a proverb which says, when you drink a glass of water, don't forget who dug the well. In other words, we're blessed to have had parents who have been able to build strong churches, strong communities, and we're the custodians. We're the ones that have been given that responsibility to continue and to pass on that banner to our children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. Happy to hear that there is this line of succession of traditions and, passing the torch. If you could just clarify how Ukrainians adapt in host countries, because already mentioned these credit societies like Zoom, Plast. So, living between the two worlds, Ukraine and the host country, practical and mentally, it can be challenging. So what strategies Ukrainians employ to adapt in new countries and keep ties with Ukraine?
Yeah, look, I think the important thing is, in a previous life, I used to chair a parliamentary commission on multicultural affairs here in Victoria, and you can do two things. You either assimilate, in other words, you drop everything, you go into the culture and the country that you're in, or you integrate. We've always been, and I say we, generally speaking, the Ukrainian communities have integrated. What they've done is they've been major players in their own societies, wherever they live, but they've also used these different structures that we have to maintain identity, and more importantly, share that identity with others, because you can have an identity, you can be very proud of your identity, but at the same time, you should share it. For example, more recently, Vyshynska, in May. In Canada, the Premier, the Prime Minister and members of the cabinet are wearing an embroidered shirt of Vyshynska. I met with the Minister for Defence here, Richard Marles. We gave him a Vyshynska. He wore it. We went to the Victorian Parliament here in Australia. We gave people an opportunity to be part of that. Why? Because we want people to understand we are contributors to wherever we live. In places like Australia, and I know it's a long way away from maybe where some of your students are, but if you look up a thing called the Snowy Mountain Scheme, you'll see that that is a hydroelectric scheme that was built. If you look at the countries that are represented as builders of that, are not only Ukrainians, they are those immigrants who came to Australia and built Australia. They're very proud of Australia, but they haven't lost their identity and they want to continue to that. Whether it be, you know, in places, for example, we have, let's take South America, let's take Brazil. And one of our major members of the Ukrainian World Congress, Professor Seryczyńska, he's a professor of law. He generationally has been, was born and thing, but the important thing is he lost his identity for a little bit, but then he rekindled it, and he is now a major player in South America of taking the Ukrainian message out. And how do they do that? It's not only the political message, it's also the heritage, it's also the culture, it's all that. So the Ukrainian World Congress, for example, its role is to continue to promote identity. We have, at this point in time, we have three major pillars, I'd call. One is defend of Ukraine. In other words, to make sure that Ukraine wins the war. Secondly is the rebuilding of the Ukraine. And the third pillar is the maintenance of our communities. That is critical. And when you start to compare, you know, we've just talked about Australia and Canada and the usual suspects. But, you know, we have communities in Africa. We have communities, for example, in Japan. We have communities in Singapore. We have, you know, the Balts. Wherever you turn, you can find the Ukrainian. And the interesting thing is, the very interesting thing is that young Ukrainians who travel around the world, who are connected with community, one of the first things they look at is, how do I connect with the community? For example, my goddaughter, Christina Vyshynska, who is a young girl who's professional, who's now in Switzerland. First thing she did was, she said to me, give me a contact. I want a contact with the Ukrainian community. So that passing on of the baton, so to speak, you know, and I think we have to be clear, you know, I want to paint a beautiful picture and say everything's thing. People interact in different ways. People can be super active and, you know, go to a meeting every week, and others, they have it in their heart. Our churches are playing a major role now at this point in time. So there is a connection. And for example, here in Melbourne, I'm part of the Ukrainian Catholic Church Cathedral. We have our cathedral 60 years old. We have just started a campaign called Preservation, because what we want to do is we want our children and grandchildren to be connected. That program is about how do you maintain identity. And some of the people that we connect with, and this is not just church, they'll say, but I don't go to church every Sunday, or I'm not part of a community. And my response to that is, that church, that community will always be there for you whenever you need it. So there'll be a point in time when you'll want to connect. And, you know, we do have this saying, you know, from cradle to grave. So we have young children who are baptized in churches. They go to schools, they, you know, do youth groups, singing, dancing, so on. And then we have people get married, and then people get older, and then we have Ukrainian retirement villages, and then we have funerals. That's life, but from cradle to grave.
Interesting. It's good to hear that this culture of flow is continuing, and a good example of multiculturalism, that, you know, being part of the society and also maintaining identity and also sharing that. And the final question for today is relates to that. Ukrainian World Congress is doing an immense job in advocating international support for Ukraine. as well as other organizations of diaspora. So what are the priorities in the domain now? Can you share some success stories of this advocacy that you witnessed?
Yeah, look, if you look at the support for Ukraine, let's look at the last 2 years and a bit. It's sad that there's a war and that Ukrainians are dying and that Russian aggression continues and Russian disinformation and propaganda continues. But on the other hand, it has galvanized our communities. It has galvanized our communities. There would be very, very few communities that have not been supporting Ukraine in some shape or form, whether it be humanitarian aid, whether it be advocacy. But we have to understand that a coordinated approach is very important. So that's where the Ukrainian World Congress, we represent the Ukrainian diaspora. There are other organizations which we invite to work with us. But, we have, for example, a program called in the Ukrainian World Congress, Unite with Ukraine. Unite with Ukraine. We've probably provided over $100 million worth of, whether it be armored vehicles, whether it be drones. For example, late last year, I was part of a delegation with the head of our, with Pavlograd, who's president, and also a gentleman called Andriy Putichny. Andriy is in Kiev. He's a Canadian who's been working us in organizing the aid. The then head of the armed forces asked for 1,000 drones. We were able to organize that very, very quickly. Others are asking for humanitarian aid. One of the biggest problems is obviously advocacy, getting our governments to support, make sure there's not Ukraine fatigue. So the Ukrainian World Congress, we meet every day, in this way on Zoom, talking to people, advocate. For example, President Zelensky's calling for the global summit in Switzerland. The job of our associations around the world is to knock on doors and make sure that their countries are represented. Why is that important? I'm an Australian. I'm of Ukrainian background, but I'm an Australian citizen. Therefore, I've contacted as co-chair of our organisation here, the government to say we want high-level representation. Prime Minister, this is important. I'm a taxpayer. I'm a citizen. I've got a right to say that. And that's why the organised community, our American colleagues, what have they done in terms of getting the support for Ukraine? So that support, the Ukrainian World Congress, this week, for example, we had we called it for an international campaign, Cover the Skies. So what we asked children to do flash mobs with umbrellas. So cover the skies. The 22nd of the 22nd of February this year, we had over 1,000 rallies in different places around the world. Amazing effort in terms of working with the Ukrainian government. And we also, interact with the Ukrainian government. We're independent of the government, but we interact. So the Ukrainian World Congress, what it really does is provide that platform for cooperation. Is everybody doing the same thing at the same time? No, but ultimately we do it together. And I think I'll go back to where we started, and that was our parents, who were very, very smart in the way they organize community. This organization, the banner you see behind me, is the Ukrainian World Congress. The Ukrainian World Congress was once the Ukrainian Congress of Free Ukrainians. So it was it changed that word free was in there because what we were doing was we were representing that part of our nation that was free and that was working for a free Ukraine. And I went to Ukrainian school, and one of my teachers, she's long gone, but she was from Kiev, Pani Lydia Hayovska Denes. She always taught us this, that wherever there is Ukrainian blood, that's where is Ukraine. And I think you can see that, that has worked since that immigration, whether it be 150 years ago, whether it be 50 years ago, whether it be 20 years ago, whether it be those people who now have left Ukraine and seeking refuge, that Ukrainian blood, that Cossack blood is flowing. It is what keeps us going. And in terms of support and your students and others that are listening, anything you can do to support Ukraine, keep in mind, you're not only supporting Ukraine, what you're doing is you're working for a new, better, free world, which is not dominated by dictators.
Thank you very much. This sounds inspiring and informative. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.